5.1 is all about our trig identities and verifying them. So before you get started in this video, make sure you have copied down your trig identities into your trig identity book. And you could do the reciprocal identities on the first page, flip it, do your quotient identities, then your Pythagorean identities, and so forth. So the first part of 5.1 is actually not new. It's something we did back in chapter 4 as well. I just want to do a quick refresher since it is showing up here as well. So when we are trying to find our trig values here, we have what sine is, what tangent is, or maybe a couple of the trig functions. We're trying to find the rest of them. We need to draw a triangle. So I'm going to start with the fact that since sine is positive and sine correlates to my y value, positive y value happens in quadrant 1 and 2. Tangent being negative means that either the x or the y is negative, but not both. So that's going to happen in quadrant 2 or 4. So the overlap happens in quadrant 2. So when I draw my triangle, I'm going to draw that triangle in quadrant 2. And my angle here is x. I know sine of that angle is 1 over 2, so opposite over hypotenuse. I would then do Pythagorean theorem, which I'd get square root of 3, making sure it's negative because I'm in quadrant 2 for that adjacent side, which if you match up to your tangent, that is the same as negative radical 3 over 3. From there, I can fill in the rest of my trig identity, or like trig functions. So I already have sine, so then I'm going to do cosine of x, which should be adjacent over hypotenuse, so negative radical 3 over 2. Tangent I already know, so then I'm going to do cosecant, which should be the reciprocal of my sine, so it's just going to be 2, or I could do hypotenuse over opposite. For secant of x, it's reciprocal of my cosine, or hypotenuse over adjacent. That is a negative 2 over radical 3, so do make sure you rationalize that to get negative 2 radical 3 over 3. And then finally I have my cotangent, which again I can do the reciprocal of my tangent, or I can just do adjacent over opposite, which is negative radical 3. Go ahead and try the second one. Again, it's not new, so pause this and try it. I'll work it out with a little bit of an explanation in a minute. Alright, first off, cosecant goes with sine, which goes with my y value, so if my sine is negative, that would be in quadrant 3 or 4. Cotangent being negative is going to happen in quadrant 2 or 4, so I should be in quadrant 4. I'm going to draw my triangle, always drawing it to the x-axis. I know cosecant's negative 7, which I can go straight from there that sine of x must be a negative 1 over 7, and that makes that a little bit easier to draw and label my triangle. From there I get, with Pythagorean theorem, that this adjacent side is going to be the square root of 48, but you can simplify that to 4 radical 3. Positive, because of which quadrant it's in. And now I have all my sides, so I can go on and fill in the rest of my trig functions. So pause this and go ahead and try to fill those in, making sure you rationalize whenever needed. There you have them. Make sure again that you rationalized if needed. Go ahead and do this one on your own. I will put out the answers in a second, but we should be there. Again, start with drawing your triangle. So I ended up in quadrant 3, figured out my sides. First I flipped it to the cosine to get the negative 2 over 3, and then I did Pythagorean theorem, and then there's the rest of my trig functions. Alright, what's listed in your packet is day 2. I'm actually moving forward using my trig identity. So we're going to start with just simplifying. So one thing that we a lot of times will look at is to factor out or factor something. So looking at these two, they're already all sine and cosine, so I can't rewrite that. But I do notice that both terms have a sine x in them. So I'm going to factor out my sine x, which leaves me with cosine squared x minus 1. Now that I see this cosine squared with this 1, that is making me think over in my head or looking at my trig identity book of this Pythagorean identity sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. If I rewrite that so that it's cosine squared minus 1, so essentially if I brought my 1 over to the left and moved my sine squared over to the right, I'm going to get that cosine squared x minus 1 is negative sine squared x. So then when I do sine x times a negative sine squared x, I get negative sine cubed x. And that's as simplified as it gets. On this side, my trig functions don't match, and this one is even a cotangent. So I'm going to start by rewriting using sine and cosine. So sine x is sine x. Cotangent becomes cosine x over sine x, and then cosine x. I want to go ahead and simplify this second term over here. So cosine x times cosine x becomes cosine squared x in my numerator, all over sine x. Now that it's all sine and cosine, I notice that I have two fractions. So I'm going to find a common denominator. So that would be sine x. So I want sine x to be my denominator. Since this is like over 1 to begin with, I had to multiply by sine x to get there. So that one becomes sine squared x. The second one already had sine x as the denominator, so it stays as cosine squared x. Looking back at that same Pythagorean identity, actually, sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. So I have 1 over sine x, which, even more simplified than that, would be cosecant x. These take time, guys, so it's okay. On verifying, that's the same thing as simplifying, except for that I tell you what your answer is. So for these, as we're going through them, feel free to pause as needed, but we're going to be basically doing the same thing we were just doing. So looking at this first one, the first thing I notice is that I have cosines in both of them, but if I factored a cosine out, I would still have a secant x, and then I'd have minus a cosine, which I can't really put those together. However, secant and cosine actually kind of go together. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite as sine and cosine. So I have cosine x. Secant is 1 over cosine x minus cosine squared x. Now this right side, I am not doing anything to. I'm bringing it down all the way. I can't just stop writing it and ignore it. I do have to carry it down, all the way, so I should have that equal sign and the sine squared coming all the way down. Cosine times 1 over cosine. My cosines will actually cancel. So I have 1 minus cosine squared x equals sine squared x. Thinking back to that Pythagorean identity that said sine squared x plus cosine squared x equals 1, this says 1 minus cosine squared. So essentially if I bring that one over to this side so that it's 1 minus cosine squared x, I'm left with sine squared x. Now that my left side and my right side match exactly, I am finished. On this one, I don't want to just rewrite as sine and cosine because that's what I did over here, and doing it over here doesn't help any since they're already sine and cosine. So what I'm actually going to do is find a common denominator. So that common denominator is going to be 1 plus cosine x times sine x. I'm going to go ahead and tell you about 90% of the time you're not going to want to multiply that out, because then you would have sine x plus sine x cosine x, which that sine x cosine x is not very helpful. So just get used to not multiplying that part out when your trig functions don't match. Every once in a while you will need to simplify, but 90% of the time you're not going to. For this first fraction, I multiplied by sine x, so sine times sine is sine squared x plus. The second fraction, I'm multiplying by 1 plus cosine x. Since that does match, the cosines kind of go together, I would go ahead and distribute that. So that's going to become cosine x plus cosine squared x. Which, while this looks worse, I do notice that I have a sine squared and plus a cosine squared in my numerator, which I already know is 1. So my numerator is actually 1 plus cosine x. My denominator is still 1 plus cosine x times sine x. And again, I'm trying to get my whole thing to equal cosecant x. Since I didn't distribute in that denominator, I can see that both my numerator and denominator have a 1 plus cosine x. So those are actually going to cancel out. So now I'm left with 1 over sine x equals cosecant x. While that's true, that's not the exact same thing as this. They have to say literally the exact same thing. So 1 over sine x is cosecant x. So now I have cosecant x equals cosecant x. And now I am finished. When you're doing these, remember to take your time, decide which side you want to manipulate, and manipulate that side. Bringing down the other side, look to rewrite with sine and cosine. If you get stuck, maybe try to factor. Look for Pythagorean identities. Don't forget, whenever you have fractions being added, you can always go to that common denominator.